All right, why don't I just go ahead and get started? I'll give a little bit of background and I'll share my screen in just a second. As I mentioned in the opening, again, it's a real honor to be the president. I appreciate the opportunity to work in this organization. The organization has meant an enormous amount to me in terms of, I kind of like to say my first intellectual awakening was feminism when I was an undergraduate, where I got kind of a perspective that I hadn't really internalized before, the ability to step outside my frame of reference and understand a big picture view that feminism afforded me. A similar thing happened when I was in a graduate student at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and I got a chance to take my second psychotherapy course, and it was taught by Rich Tedeschi. Some of you may know him from the world of post-traumatic growth, but he's also a psychotherapy integrationist. And it started there, the whole idea that there are these different schools of thought and that they relate to each other to foster, we can relate them, we can dialogue about them, we can explore their possible connections. And that started me on a journey that has continued to this day. And it's really an honor to be here in relationship to the presidency. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and enable that. So my talk today is on a common core, toward a common core, the problems, the mechanisms, and principles at the center of psychotherapy. And I'm going to be coming at this, the common core, through a particular angle. And I'm going to be sharing you a few insights from the unified theory. The unified theory is a network of ideas that I've developed on a 20-year journey that actually first orient towards psychology into psychotherapy and then actually evolve into what I consider actually be an adequate unified theory of knowledge that affords us new ways to think about our subjective experience of being in the world, physics, natural science, the social sciences and humanities, and may afford us a new way to achieve what Edward Wilson called consilience, which is a more unified, coherent, integrated view of the world. And so it's a real honor to be sharing that perspective with you in the context of the 38th annual SEPI conference and given as the presidential address. Of course, I'm Gregg. I'm a professor at James Madison University. So where are we going to enter into this next hour? And of course, the first thing is to kind of get specific about the four domains that make up the common core. And you'll notice a theme here. I'm going for numbers. So there's four different themes that make up the common core. I'm then going to situate that in a particular perspective that affords us a new three-layered view of psychotherapy integration. I alluded this in my opening lecture, opening discussion, and I'm going to reiterate it here again because it's the fundamental take-home message, at least that I want to impart and afford some conversation around as a new way to kind of frame the landscape of psychotherapy integration, where we're going to look at unified, integrated, and a common core as a sort of layered process. I'm then going to shift and just give you a little bit of background on what this unified theory is, and then hone in on a particular set of ideas that organize a bridging point in the common core, specifically how we think about certain problems, the mechanisms and the processes associated with them, and how we might map those into 5 systems of character adaptation, which I believe provide us a way to think about how the human operating system adapts or fails to adapt, i.e. creates maladaptive patterns in a way that's very consistent with the insights from the major schools, but in a way that coherently interrelates them as opposed to situates them or positions them against one another. Then from there, I'm going to propose that we can think about the cycles of maladaptive patterns as triple negative neurotic loops. And I invite you to take this back to the work that you do and to think about sort of shining the light on what it is that's happening in relationships to get them folks to get intrapsychically or interpersonally entangled and then get trapped into particular kinds of problems that feel, well, like they're dead-ended or they're jammed into a particular narrow spot, and they just feel defensive and miserable and irritated, and they want to escape that. What does that look like? How do we understand that process? I'm going to suggest a pretty simple way of breaking that process up in the form of triple negative neurotic loops. And then finally, there's this issue, of course, as therapists, we want to be able to come in and operate in a particular way that affords a principle-based analysis of the problems, and then affords us awareness of the kinds of processes that would engender our capacity to enter into the world as counselors, psychological doctors, healers, and reverse some of those maladaptive loops, to lessen them and perhaps turn them around into more virtuous cycles. And it is this, for this, I have built a system, a framework of integrated approach to psychological mindfulness called COMMO, which I will describe a little bit. And so ultimately, the point of this is, here's a map, here's a framing. I'm going to connect with some of the work in relationship to the common core. I'm going to connect with the work of integration, then position both in relationship to the psychotherapy integration movement in general, and then offer some frameworks that allow us perhaps to box in, and not in a way that limits, but in a way that clarifies particular kinds of sets of insights by transitioning them from the single schools into ideas that the schools are actually focused on different systems of mental adaptation, these character adaptation systems. Those character adaptation systems afford us a way to frame some of the maladaptive processes. And then we can bring the kind of principle-based interventions and organized by a thing called COMMO. So let's start with the journey of a core toward a common core. As I mentioned in the overview, my colleagues, Marv Goldfried, Jeffrey Smith, and initially Matt Mascolo engaged in a series of webinar discussions whereby we argued that there was a way to move really from the common factor view and its general focus on the relationship to a more organized perspective around the common core. And if you ask me what a common core is, it's like, well, what a graduate student who is learning psychotherapy is able to say, this is what we mean by psychotherapy, such that we can specify that psychotherapy addresses particular kinds of human problems. We have some framework of understanding mechanisms of change, and I will argue that especially based on the work of Jeffrey Smith and Richard Lane and others, we can organize those mechanisms, many of them tied to basic processes, basic research paradigms. There are core change in relational processes and foundational principles that we are guided by. And this structures psychotherapy not in a school of thought, but in a human endeavor that can be specified and then grown in a multiplicity of different ways that afford richness and pluralism and different perspectives. But it is this center that we want to grow from. And I owe a lot to one of the co-founders, Marvin Goldfried, who has been emphasizing over the last couple of years, and here in an American Psychologist article on what obtaining consensus, and asking what holds us back from developing frameworks of agreement. And he asked essentially and invited those that are oriented in the psychotherapy integration movement to move beyond the exploration and begin to ground what it is that we can agree. And this initiated this intersection between Marv Goldfried's work, Jeffrey Smith's work, and my own, and others in the unification movement situated this so that we could say, hey, let's specify. And one of the big early moves that we made was the argument that the primary problems that are present in psychotherapy can be framed in terms of maladaptive patterns. Specifically, a maladaptive pattern refers to a tendency to respond and invest in situations or triggers in a way that results in distress or dysfunction and moves folks away from well-being. Of course, in any particular instance, you could say that's a maladaptive adjustment, but entrenched then refers to this idea that are clinically significant, repeated over time, generalizable, so that you have learned a particular path, and that's a path that we're going to want to address in psychotherapy that shifts the focus into the future. I want to be clear that this model is very important because it actually is quite inconsistent at least in the United States, with the broad model of mental disorders as mental diseases. And many in counseling and psychotherapy have long disputed that notion, but this makes it explicit, and it affords a potential classification system or framing of what these kinds of maladaptive problems are. In fact, I'm going to suggest to you that triple negative neurotic loops afford us a framework for really honing in on maladaptive problems that are associated with the internalizing conditions. Later in this talk, as I suggested, I will introduce a few ideas from the unified theory that might help us give us a frame of reference. I'm going to stop a second here, just make sure. Folks hear me okay? Just want to make sure. Okay, great. Sorry, there's I'll proceed. Pop in the chat box in case. Later in this talk, I'll move from the unified theory that might help us in terms of character adaptation systems, the triple negative neurotic loops, and this COM-MO. The mechanisms, as I suggested, Jeffrey Smith has emphasized, building on some foundational work in biobehavioral neuroscience that is long-standing, is frameworks for understanding core processes that'll afford change. In his earlier talk that he contributed in the opening, Richard Lane talked about the connection between emotion, memory, and learning, and talked about core processes associated with extinction, for example, and a memory reconsolidation, which activation, like arousal activation, emotion, the old pattern is then juxtaposed with new and surprising information that temporarily results in some volatility of the old memory structure. And then in the context of reframing the narrative about what that means and relating to that, that system can then get integrated into the structure and afford new pathways of learning. So here what we're talking about is a basic biopsychomechanistic process, which we can hone in on in relationship to what kinds of processes might afford the undergirding of a corrective mechanisms, might afford an undergirding of a meaningful corrective emotional experience. And a more general point here is that this affords us a way to connect the basic aspects of psychotherapy and the work that we do to foundational research in psychological science. Indeed, I'm going to argue that this connection to psychological science is crucial. However, unlike the emphasis here, I'm going to argue that it's actually psychological science that needs to be updated in the way we think about it. And then from there, we can then bridge to have a psychological science that's available to us, that's up to the task of doing the hard work of psychotherapy. Crucial to the process of psychotherapy are, well, processes, okay? And processes here focus on the relational, developmental, and contextual aspects that facilitate psychological change. Now, if we think about the common factors, by far, the most obvious common factor that transcends the therapeutic process is having to do with the alliance. And this remains, of course, just the quality of the therapeutic relationship in general, like, hey, I like my therapist, I think they're competent. But going back to Bourdain's original analysis in 1979, we can also say, yes, it's the quality coupled to the capacity to build a shared narrative about what's going on, that is the conceptualization, and then cultivate investment in change and outcome that might be different, and then to track that outcome and modify it accordingly, especially relative to recent Scott Miller and others who do outcome-informed psychotherapy. So this framing is absolutely central, and we can contextualize this as a core relational psychotherapeutic relational process. We also want to think about what are the general processes associated with change. So for example, we have the trans-theoretical model, where we're moving from pre-contemplation to contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance. I emphasize a big three of processes in a relational context, whereby the psychotherapeutic work is to focus on the cultivation of insight and awareness. I'm going to build a better understanding. I'm going to figure out what it is about my situation that I need to accept, and the skills upon which and the framings upon which that afford that acceptance. And then ultimately, what are the domains? This, of course, is resonant for many who would recognize this as a serenity prayer. What are the domains that I actually can change? And can I cultivate the skills that enable me to be different when I need to be? Marv Goldfried has a brilliant stepwise frame for this in relationship to understanding individuals coming in and recognizing that they're in a place of unconscious incompetence. The therapy affords awareness that enables them to see where they're having difficulty. He frames this as conscious incompetence. Then we gain some skills of active change. And then ultimately at the level of maintenance, we instantiate some new learning patterns and have ways of being in the world that afford us the capacity to just be naturally competent, i.e. unconsciously competent. It becomes natural. And we can see this juxtaposed in relationship to certain kinds of corrective emotional experience in this stepwise pattern, whereby we're increasing awareness, having a corrective emotional experience that relates, and then ongoing capacities for skill building. So these processes create a framework for understanding change in relation. And then finally, again, building off Mark Goldfried's work on what we can agree, identifying core principles. Hey, when somebody comes in, we want to foster hope, expectation, and motivation, want to ground that in a healthy alliance, build awareness of why they're having difficulties, engage in corrective experiences. And so obviously the processes and principles network themselves together. There would be lots of different other kinds of principles. In fact, when I developed a chapter on teaching clinical decision-making, I listed 17 different principles that might be guiding one's work. This is certainly an open view, but it's essentially one that then enables us to specify with clarity the kinds of guidance that we engage in, the kinds of decision-making guidance, our values, and the kinds of work that we believe that we're engaged in and committed to. So when we have the common core, what the common core is doing is it's evolving the common factors view and providing a more rich and specified delineation of what it is that, say, a graduate student in therapy and counseling would be identified as. Hey, I work to foster awareness of these kinds of problems. I have some basic understanding of the underlying mechanisms at sort of the root microscopic causal level. I understand the broad dynamic processes and I'm guided by these principles. And this cultivates in me an identity as a counselor or psychotherapist. Then we're going to shift from that perspective and zoom out and introduce here, I want to introduce and discuss a new complementary pathway for psychotherapy integration. And again, we'll dialogue more about this tomorrow in the invited address, where I've invited Andre Marquis, Jack Anchin, Jeffrey Magnavita to come and talk about this paper that we co-authored together, Unification, the Fifth Pathway to Psychotherapy Integration. As I suggested in my talk, with the metaphor that we came up with over time is the metaphor that unification is a meta-theoretical view that affords us the capacity to reframe the schools of thought, metaphorically each as mountains, and then enables us to see the mountain range. So I would argue that in the context of psychotherapy, we can see 7 major approaches. There's a biological, biomedical approach that our psychiatrist colleagues generally are trained and operating in. There are then major individual approaches, the psychodynamic approach, where it's focused on relations, defenses, subconscious processes, and the like. The humanistic approach was focused on the relational qualities, as well as the emphasis on emotion and the core organismic valuing process, and the processes why that gets stunted or judged, and then creates all sorts of conflicts and problems. We have a behavioral view that emphasizes our habit formation, emphasizes the environmental context and the repertoires of procedural learning. And we get a cognitive view that emphasizes both the attributions, expectations, and interpretations in the moment, the core beliefs that somebody has about self, and then we can extend that into narrative and existential views, where we talk about the ways in which people justify meaning-making structures, make sense out of their lives, and whether they do that successfully, adaptively, or fail to do that. Of course, individuals don't live in isolation, they live in relationships. A prominent perspective then moves out from the individual perspectives and places us in social and, of course, therapeutic perspectives, family systems, where we have boundaries and roles and cybernetic processes at the level of the whole system. And of course, that's networked and nested into the social systems, where we have many perspectives that afford us a critique of issues of injustice, of power, of the processes by which social constructed knowledge emerges. These 7 major approaches really afford doorways into thinking. There are, of course, many others, somatic approaches and others, but these afford sort of a rich characterization of the major taxonomies. And as the leaders and legacy of this particular, of the psychotherapy integration movement said, well, wait a minute, if we have these different perspectives, where should we be setting up shop? On what mountain should we locate ourselves? On what paradigm should we ground our perspective? And we have the psychotherapy integration path that says, hey, there's common factors. They're all mountains. It's really the mountains that matter, not so much the naming. And what you do is a relational healing process. We're trying to evolve that into the common factors. We then have technical eclecticism that emphasizes the interventions, the specific kinds of change techniques that you might do, and how you might test those to see whether they're empirically supported, and how do you juxtapose a collection of empirically supported interventions and place those in a toolbox that you use appropriately in context. Assimilative integration shifts from the idea of techniques for specific interventions into concepts and encourage us, although we might stay situated in a particular mountain, to cut across those mountains and pull concepts from others' perspectives. So for example, if you're an ACT person and you learn about experiential avoidance, you may get tapped on the shoulder by a psychodynamic perspective and say, hey, you might want to check out the concept of repression and defense because experiential avoidance actually has an enormous amount of overlap with the concept of repression and defense. And if you operate from an assimilative integrative perspective, you don't find that to be aversive at all. You assume that there are other perspectives that have rich and interesting concepts, and you look to assimilate them and learn and grow from them. So we can see with technical eclecticism, there's an emphasis on techniques. With assimilative integration, it's an emphasis on concepts. And then finally, theoretical integration looks at the underlying causal explanatory mechanisms and then looks to blend them. And we have these in Ryle's cognitive analytic approach, and of course, Paul Wachtel's cyclical psychodynamic approach, where he focused on the intrapsychic motives and conflicts from a dynamic perspective, grounded in Dollard and Miller's work in particular, into then a behavioral learning model in relation. Okay. So what we can see here is we can see framings that afford us an opportunity to think about communication between the paths, whereby those that come from an integrative perspective say, hey, we have to systematically engage in conversation. I saw in the chat there was a question about language, and absolutely, there is a massive problem. If you enter into a particular mountain, you have your core concepts and categories that serve as the tools for sense making. If you enter through a behavioral lens or a psychodynamic lens or a humanistic lens, you're afforded different concepts and categories that carve up the system in different ways. Now, they definitely aspectualize different key features, but it's also the case that their language overlaps, and a big problem is to figure that out. The mission of SEPI is fundamentally try to get clear about that, foster dialogue and communication, and see what kinds of paths we might be able to engender. And it is an absolutely crucial, and it has transformed our attitudes about the single schools, which evolved then into kind of an eclectic attitude, into certainly questions about how we might be systematic. Unification, though, is different. Unification isn't the process by which you gender communication within the schools, okay? But it's the idea that there are opportunities to step back and see the whole. Specifically, the defining feature of a unified view is a meta-theoretical perspective that looks at the landscape. And my work with Andre Marquis, Jack Enchen, and others, I think specifies the idea that there are particular kinds of perspectives. You can take epistemological perspectives like with Wilbur. You can take complex adaptive biopsychosocial dynamic perspectives as Jack Enchen and Jeffrey Magnavita did. And you can take metaphysical views like I did, specifying concepts like mind and culture and consciousness in particular kinds of ways that then afford ways to see the whole landscape. And our conversations suggested that our epistemological, systemic, metaphysical, ontological views really do allow you to see the whole. And actually, although initially they sound quite different, they really are quite complementary. And so what this suggests here is that we can actually now shift the conversation a bit to a three-layered view of psychotherapy integration, where the common core provides the center ground, the schools of thought provide established frames across the primary psychotherapy integration pathways to foster communication and blending. And then finally, a unified view affords a coherent framing for that whole. So that can foster a shared set of understandings. And so we get this perspective in relationship to a three-layered view of unification, integration, and the common core. So one of the things that I'd like to now shift gears with that orientation about the common core specified, and then shifted that in relationship to, I'd like to talk just a little bit about some insights afforded by the unified theory. So the unified theory is a set of ideas that emerged in me with some collaboration of others that gave rise to a mapping of the field. I published on this in 2011 in a book called A New Unified Theory of Psychology. And this diagram is suggestive of sort of the core message, which basically says we have our physical and biological understandings pretty well. However, exemplified by Skinner and Freud, we can't really put them together in a coherent way. Well, the unified theory says, yes, we can, and it affords us new big picture ideas, essentially to put the puzzle pieces together. So for example, it comes with a new map of big history or of the cosmos and the way in which cosmology evolves in terms of various dimensions of complexity. And this new map affords us a new way to think about the relationship between matter and life and mind and culture. And it specifies it in a way that I think gives us some real novel approaches for really defining the ontology of both mental, as it relates to the animal kingdom, and human persons as it relates to the dimension of human culture, which is specifically defined here in this system, different way than in some way other characters. It also comes with a way of framing human consciousness, specifically it updates Freud's classic model and says we do have an animal experiential system, although it's a lot more sophisticated than Freud suggested. We then have a private egoic narrator and a public manager. And there are dynamic filtering processes between these, specifically an attentional filter that relates our sub and unconscious processes and brings them onto our stage of experience, and a justifying Freudian filter that navigates that in relationship to the ego and self. And then finally, a Rogerian filter that's navigating our tendencies to be judged and concerned about that and manage impressions. This new dynamic model is very commonsensical in many ways, but it affords a way to piece together a whole bunch of different lines of research. It also comes with a new cognitive model, specifically the processes by which the mind layers its neuroinformation processing system. And this cognitive model combines some of the best of evolutionary thinking and the novel 4E cognitive science view. I'm not going to specify in relationship to this because I want to get to the punchline, but the point of it is that we have basic big picture theories around how the universe evolves in general, the implications for human consciousness for that universe, the implications for cognition from animal into human. And crucially, it also comes with a map of the human relationship system. And it's a map that I think many therapists will find interesting, because one of the things that it does is it takes a connection between attachment theory, specifically the idea that we're tracking our relationships with others and whether or not we're secure, known, and valued, that's the black line, and what level do we have dependency and autonomy, and are we secure in that? Attachment theorists will recognize these elements as some of the core dimensions that are part of our whole initial parent-child relation, and then the way we relate to the social field in general. It also combines that with a very other popular model called the interpersonal circumplex, and merges the interpersonal circumplex and attachment theory together to give an understanding of the human relationship system as a self-other internal working model that's really defined around this core idea of our need to be seen, known, and valued. That's the black line. And the processes by which we position ourselves in relationship to others, specifically vertically on a status dimension, horizontally on a loving, liking, or hostile anger, hostile contempt dimension, and how much engagement we engage in. That's the green line. And it suggests that we've combined our attachment systems and our cooperative competitive systems into a relational matrix for our internal working models. And that's what guides us in our interpersonal exchanges. And it suggests that our emotions are energized motivational responses in response to change in our perceptual experiences around these particular dimensions, of course, placed in context. So the tree of knowledge gives us a new map. We have a new map of human consciousness and cognition, and a new map of the relational system. Why is that relevant? Well, what it gives rise to is the idea that we can now go back to some of the key insights of the major schools of thought and suggest that actually what they're doing is they're emphasizing particular systems of adaptation. And when we emphasize systems of adaptation, that affords us a new way of thinking about the field. So currently what we're given is we're given an opportunity to enter the field from various different perspectives. We can enter the act perspective as a new wave CBT. We can do classic Beckian or Ellis perspectives. We can follow the psychodynamic line. But these really then represent schools that are anchored to particular aspects of the human experience. The unified approach takes a different view and says, let's understand human psychology writ large, and then let's look at the key insights from the various schools and then organize them. And what emerges when you do that is a thing called character adaptation systems theory. Character adaptation systems theory posits that what's actually happened with the different schools of thought is that actually they've honed in on different systems of adaptation. I'll give a medical analogy. So medicine is reasonably well organized by the science of biology. And when we think about medicine, we think about, you have a general practitioner, if you go to your medical doctor, at least in the States, and then there's specialization. You might specialize in the circulatory heart system. You might specialize in the reproductive system. You might specialize in the gastrointestinal system. If you have a specific problem in those domains, you're going to get referred to a specialist. But nobody thinks that the answer to biological health is going to be found solely in the gastrointestinal system or solely in the circulatory system. The reason is because we have a unified theory, essentially. Again, it's not complete, but it's a framework that allows us to understand that the human organism is made up of multiplicity of different systems. Well, Cass suggests that, in fact, what's actually happened is that different orientations have honed in on specific systems, and there is a way that we can put them together. Cass argues in particular that we need to think about the human organism on three vectors. This should feel familiar that for folks that think in systems, there's a biological vector, as a genetic and a physiological system. There's a learning and developmental vector that starts at a distal structure and goes into proximal learning situations. And there's a socio-historical context. In other words, there's a biopsychosocial context here. And that history is a developmental structure across three vectors that gave us a big picture view of a biopsychosocial perspective. And then we want to place the individual in context. And this argues that there are particular systems of adjustment. There's a habit system, an experiential system, a relational system, a defensive system, and a justification system. The habit system is about your daily routines, the stimulus response chaining patterns that emerge, and your procedural memory. The experiential system is tied more to episodic memory, the perceptual, motivational, emotional field of your mammal self. The relational system is more your primate attachment self and the way you're checking your status and your belonging. And finally, the justification and defensive systems refer to the relationship between those core systems and your person self-conscious system, that's your justification system, and the way that system is regulating your more animalistic tendencies that guide your habits and procedural knowledge, your perspectival, experiential, and your primate relational knowledge systems. If we start to look at the human this way, and then think about the bridge to the individual schools of psychotherapy, what we can actually see is that the behavioral tradition is honed in on the habit system. The experiential, especially more recently, emotion focus from the humanistic lineage, the emotion focus work of Les Greenberg really emphasizes, and Sue Johnson emphasizes the experiential. The psychodynamic lineage, especially after the relational turn, can be seen as emphasizing the attachment and relational systems, as well as the defensive systems that are regulating self and subconscious process. And then we can see the cognitive and then cognitive and existential narrative perspectives as really emphasizing the propositional networks that are labeled here as justification systems. Why is this relevant? Well, now what we're suggesting is actually what humans have is a system of adaptation that's stacked across these 5 different domains of habit, experiential, relational, defense, and justification. And it suggests that each of the individual schools are indeed emphasizing particular types of both habit tendencies, or adaptive tendencies, and then they're there to identify, become aware of, and offer ways of fixing, adjusting the maladaptive systems. So then this does suggest that each one of these systems can be framed as honing in on an adaptive system and then offering perspectives that identify maladaptive patterns and then transition those maladaptive patterns through intervention to more adaptive ones. So with that context, we now have shifted and connected the entrenched maladaptive patterns. We've now mapped them into the specific major individual schools. Now what I'd like to do is say, well, what are the processes by which we can see the emergence of maladaptive patterns? And I'm going to suggest the idea of triple negative neurotic loops. What are they? Triple negative neurotic loops are the idea that negative events happen, and they trigger negative feelings. And the first thing I want to say is this is okay. Okay. But the fact that what happens in relationship to this is the key element that completes the loop is that there are negative reactions to the negative events and negative feeling relation. And it is this process that actually creates a cascade. And the analogy I often use in my clients is that what you end up doing is you end up bringing a water to a grease fire, essentially. In other words, grease fire is bad. I have negative feelings about this. I'm going to do something. I'm going to avoid and control. And actually the processes by which you engage the avoid and control, although they make sense, they actually spread the fire, unfortunately. Okay. So a triple negative neurotic loop really hones in on the negative reactions to negative events that trigger negative feelings. So we have a situation, bad things have happened. I feel negative, and then I hate that this has happened. I hate that I feel negative. I have to escape this. I have to control this. I have to avoid this. And it's the I have to escape, I have to control, I have to avoid that is central then to the triple negative neurotic looping. And this then is going to create the closed feedback loop, which then proceeds in producing more negative situations and more negative feelings, hence closing the loop. So the argument here is that with triple negative neurotic loops, what's going on? You get a significant psychological stressor or injury. And these, to the extent that this really impacts, this sets the stage for understanding why high trait neuroticism is so unbelievably important. If you're already sitting on a high negative emotional horse, as it were, that's reactive, the interaction of the stressor and the negative feeling, that then going to situate a negative reaction. So instead of being able to hold that, the individual attempts to cope via escape, self-critical, controlling thoughts, engages in resentful attacks. These attempts to adapt, but they ultimately fail and they create more problems, and the individual then doubles down on them. So negative reactivity to negative feelings triggered by negative events then is central to this looping process. The unified approach then that we can then show this represents the core of the internalizing process. There are problems and heightened feelings of negative emotion, anxiety, depression, lowered life satisfaction, stressful lives, and then difficulty with an identity. Who am I? How am I relating to others? And how should I feel in relation? And the argument is that this is the fundamental structure of the internalizing conditions. If you're aware of the hierarchical taxonomy of psychopathology, you know that we're seeing big picture views that really cluster the psychopathology in different ways. And perhaps the biggest one, most relevant for psychotherapy, are the internalizing conditions. We, of course, have somatic problems, externalizing, impulse control problems. There are thought disorders, psychotic related problems. But the center point, arguably, of what we do in psychotherapy are manage the internalizing conditions. And the argument here is that we can track maladaptive problems through negative reactions to negative feelings sparked by negative events. And that allows us to understand the connection between things like trait neuroticism, psychological injury, and adverse childhood experiences, relational context, environmental variables that afford the holding of negative situations and negative feelings versus the reverse, such as limited psychological social nourishment, impoverished environment, skill deficits, difficulties with coping, experiential avoidance or safety behaviors that don't allow the individual to integrate and cohere, relational reactivity, etc. Okay, so the argument here is that this affords us a particular kind of architectural structure that specifies these dynamics. If that's the case, and we're psychological doctors, then the next question, well, what is it that we would do? And the argument here that emerges from the unified theory is that we need to shift our focus on negative reaction and hold that with a calm MO mindset. So if we have the model of human consciousness, where a negative situation triggers a negative feeling, and this idea that I hate feeling this way, this gives rise to these negative loops. The argument is that what we have instantiated in an internalized condition is an inner critic that has negative attitudes about negative feelings and tries to escape them. Thus, the negative feelings come on, there's an avoidance and control initial reaction. That, however, results in the emotion not being integrated coherently, and it builds up in relationship to, if you understand semantic associative memory networking, what that means is there's a trigger, but it's not integrated or coheres, so it sits there. And then there's another trigger, and that gets sitting there. And this is the whole idea that it's building up inside me, okay? And then if there is an event that triggers so that you can't avoid and control, what happens is that comes on the stage and it activates all the other elements that weren't integrated. And then this coheres into a flooding experience where all of a sudden either rage or panic or depression, such that then the individual is flooded and overwhelmed and then feels all of that, feels it rawly, and often then feels compelled to act on it. So they become all of it. And the nature of emotion is that it's pretty impulsive and short term. It's an animalistic structure, and then it acts in a way that's inconsistent often with the adaptive structures of the human person cultural level. And as a function of that, makes you impulsive, makes you erratic, like you punch somebody, or you run off stage in a panic, or you collapse into a bed completely. And then the lesson is, well, I knew my negative feelings were a problem. Look at how much trouble they caused me. The argument here is that we can bring a psychological mindset to these processes. So if we start with the critic view, what we really want to do is we want to shift into what's called an emotional sweet spot. The emotional sweet spot teaches individuals to be aware and attuned to the negative situations and negative feelings in particular, and to hold them on the one hand, so you integrate them and recognize them as bad. Negative feelings are not bad. Negative feelings are totally proper to negative situations. So we need to be aware and attuned to that. And of course, the emotion focus folks are really keen on that. At the same time, we need to make sure that these experiences don't necessarily result in excessive or impulsive action that are inconsistent with adaptive behavior for persons. Ergo, we need to also adaptively regulate them. So the emotional sweet spot is holding feelings in relationship to awareness and attunement and adaptive regulation. How to do that? Well, you train individuals to stop, instead of defensively and mindlessly reacting to the situation just as negative, you actually shift to a responsive and reflective mindfulness approach. The argument from a CALM MO is you start with a metacognitive view, where you get a metacognitive observer that can then function as your new modus operandi, and that you can see yourself. You become the object of your own thoughts, where you can see your feeling self, your primate feeling self, your egoic narrator, your need to be public managing. And then from this metacognitive stance of an imaginary sage, we cultivate a particular attitude of curiosity and openness and wonder, an acceptance of what is in relationship to the world, a loving, compassionate attitude towards self and other, and a motivated stance toward valued states of being. So, and what this argues, and if you're familiar with ACT and interpersonal neurobiology, Dan Siegel's work in particular, you actually see specific elements of both of those perspectives being integrated here. So the argument here is that triple negative neurotic looping is at the core of many of the internal conditions, and it's a function of a relationship to emotion where the negative reaction is to negative feelings. And there's a critical, control, rejecting, irritable, hostile, tense, defensive stance that is can be characterized as a critic. And we want to cultivate a curious, open wonderment that's accepting, loving, compassion, and motivated from the stance of an internalized stage. That affords individuals to move from critic to calm. How would you do this? We want to teach individuals about the process, help articulate what it is to shift one's perspective so you become the object of your own thoughts. Children learn how to do this. With most individuals with some guidance can learn how to shift the subject-object relation. You learn what it is simply first to observe and then to cultivate a particular curious, accepting, loving attitude. You begin to question statements, understand, hey, how do I understand this? How do I cultivate this? You do it with relatively easy things first, and then you learn examples, role play, and ultimately, ideally, activate this. And to use Marv Goldfried's notion, it becomes natural. You're sort of like unconsciously, and I would say, in fact, I have my little COM-MO flashlight here as a symbol. I would say my general tendencies now to get activated immediately, drop into, at least have access to a metacognitive observer that can shine a particular kind of curious, accepting, loving, compassionate, motivated light on it. So in summary, I believe we can move toward a common core. I think we can shift the idea of common factors into a common core, specify elements associated with the primary problems as intrapsychic and interpersonal maladaptive elements that get entrenched. I think we can then underline the mechanisms of those, the processes and principles. I think we can also evolve from a perspective of that to see the three-layered view. And then from the vantage point of the unit, from this unified view, we can then get understand Psychotherapy integration conversation as dialogue and communication between the various structures centered around a common core. And at least the unified theory says, hey, we can actually move beyond that, specify domains of character adaptation, align those with the key insights of the individual perspectives, which afford us a much more available crosstalk and much more conceptual linkage between the various perspectives. And then shift that to understand, oh, well, these are systems of adaptation, and that the core is a maladaptive element. Well, if negative events are negative feelings, and if we look at the way the cognitive people think about thoughts and relation, if we look at the secondary negative and maladaptive emotions, if we look at psychodynamic defenses, if we look at experiential avoidance, we can see that actually negative reactions to negative events causing negative situations is at the core of a lot of these perspectives. Because really what we're seeing with internalized conditions, there's an internalized critic against the self in relationship to negative feelings that are caused by negative events that situate an individual to have a fragile, reactive stance that's vulnerable and then is vulnerable to becoming flooded and overwhelmed. When I teach an emotional sweet spot that coheres and integrates and then adaptively regulates and shifts that inner critic to a curious, accepting, loving, compassionate, motivated toward valued states of being individual, i.e. when we teach our clients how to turn on a COM-MO flashlight and respond rather than react with curiosity, acceptance, loving, compassion, instead of the inner critic that they learn.